Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of video feedback. So for our assignment this week, what I was looking for you to do was basically control the depth of the area of focus in a photograph. The word or the term depth of field is typically what we associate with that. But just in layman's terms, what we're looking for is for you to be able to have one thing in focus and the rest of the image out of focus, which would be called a small depth of field, and then everything in focus, which would be called a large depth of field. So let's look at your images and talk about some of the different things going on in there. So first up we have Hirayasu's images, and I do apologize if I pronounce anybody's names wrong. It's kind of crazy with the online thing, not actually hearing you guys introduce yourselves. So you guys got to give me a pass on that one. So this is his small depth of field image. Of course, we go in and look at our file info. We've got an f-stop of 4.5, which is very appropriate in this instance here. Now this ISO setting, that's really high, 6400. Boy, in this instance, we can bring that down a lot. And what that bringing that ISO number down a lot is going to do is it's going to give us a lot better image quality. When we're using an ISO of 6400, if you remember from the modules, that's going to give us a lot of noise. And when we have a lot of noise, it kind of has the effect of graininess on the image. So f-stop setting is perfect, f4.5, but definitely that ISO I'd like to see a little bit lower, especially you're working with stuff outside. And we'll zoom in here, and this is what I'm talking about with the ISO, where it's starting to get kind of grainy and pixelated in there. That is definitely what happens when you use an ISO setting that's too high. So for the depth of field, you can see our background is out of focus here and the flowers in the foreground are in focus. This depth of field, small depth of field technique, I think you nailed the setting of the aperture on that, and it's working here. The one thing I might suggest is, like, to me, this is so much more of an interesting shot when we can go in here and let me just crop this out, something like this, where it's really simple and clean, and our eye is really drawn to this one flower here, as opposed to the previous image where there's a lot going on here. And I'm not so sure I'm super crazy about this right here, where it looks like either the deer have eaten the flowers or they've fallen off or whatever the case is. It's kind of, it almost conflicts with what's going on here. So especially when you're first starting out, more often than not, simple is better, simple and clean. So you got the depth of field part right compositionally. I think I'd like to see you simplify this image a little bit more. And then your large depth of field image here. Again, I suspect that you probably got your settings correct. Yep, your f22, and yes, your ISO. Perfect, 100. A third of a second exposure there. You need to have your camera on a tripod for that. And you can see this image is blurry. That's because you have a very slow shutter setting. And when you have a slow shutter setting, some of the shake of your hand is going to cause a little bit of motion blur. So that's what's going on in this image. So the solution to this image is either use a faster shutter setting, or if you don't have the right lighting to do that, then you got to go in and use a tripod, put the camera on a tripod, and that way the camera is not going to move. And okay, let's say you don't have a tripod, put your camera on something like a garbage can or a wall or a porch or a balcony or anything like that is going to give you the stability you need to make sure that the camera doesn't shake and give us that movement blur. So that's what's going on here. Your depth of field looks like it's fine, although the image overall is blurry, so it's kind of hard to tell ultimately what's going on there. So, you got to put these lessons together. Last week's lesson was about your shutter and the importance of that. Don't forget those things as you move along through these assignments. So look forward to seeing what you have for our next assignment. And next up here we have Greg's images. And we've got our small depth of field shot here, a large depth of field shot there. Really good example of the difference between the two settings. In this image, our eye is really drawn to the texture in the lampshade. In this image, there's sort of like a play that is working between these two objects. This, which sort of has this very appealing geometric pattern of all the vertical rectangular shapes, versus this that seems to be much more related to color and texture. So there's a really neat play between the two, and I think that play is really interesting, whereas that play doesn't happen in this shot because our eye is really just interested in the thing that's in focus. So Greg, really good job here. We'll just take a look at your file settings. 2.8 on the small depth of field. Perfect on that. And I'm going to guess we've got a high aperture value, 22, right on the money there. An exposure time of 5 seconds. And, again, when we're using those slow shutter settings, just need to be very aware of making sure the camera does not move at all. And in this instance, it's looking pretty sharp here. But just be aware of that as you're going along with those shutter settings. So great job here, Greg. I think you pretty much nailed this one. You are dialed in, so look forward to seeing what you have for our next one. Okay, next up we have McKenna's images. And first and foremost here, McKenna, what I want to call your attention to is the type of file that you've submitted. So you've given us what's known as a PSD file, or basically a Photoshop format file, which is fine because I have Photoshop on my computer. But one of the things I want you guys to get in the habit of is learning to change the file format settings, which in this case I had asked you to turn in JPEGs. So if we just do a save as, and then under the file format here, just switch it from Photoshop to JPEG, and then it'll actually save this as a JPEG. And then it'll ask us for the resolution quality. And in this instance, we just want to keep that to maximum. So that's fine. I'm going to actually undo that. And I just noticed that you've got some Photoshop work going in here. You've done some adjustments, which is great. I really like the fact that, if we go in and look at your original image, kind of sort of dull. And I really like the fact that through your adjustments here, you've kind of made those reds stand out and really pop, and you've given us a little bit of contrast to this. So great job with that. A little bit more of an advanced technique that you're working with here, but nonetheless, I'm glad you're experimenting and having fun and trying new things. So that is all fine and dandy. So this is your small depth of field image. You're at an f-stop of 4.5, ISO 200, exposure 1/400th of a second. Perfect settings there. And again, we see our background here is really out of focus, and our flowers in the foreground here are in sharp focus. So good job on this, and really clean, nice shot. I think it works well for this assignment, and I especially like the red flowers contrasted up against the green background. Typically you'll notice that when we have reds and greens together in the same shot, it usually is very visually appealing to the eye. So good job on that. Really like everything you did there. And then your large depth of field image. Again, we'll go into your file info and see you're at f-stop of 10, which definitely f-stop of 10 is going to give us a large depth of field. You know, in this instance, you probably could drop your exposure down to 1/200th of a second, and then that aperture setting would go up to f16. It would even give you a larger depth of field, a little bit sharper in that background. But you know, you got the spirit of the assignment. You know what we were looking for here, and I think you pretty much nailed it. So other than just this Photoshop files, everything looks really good here, McKenna. So keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week. Okay, and next up we have Natasha's images. And for shot, small depth of field. Wow, stunning shot here, Natasha. Great job. The technique is performed masterfully here. Our background is really soft and out of focus, and our little leaf on, I'm presuming that's a dock or some sort of deck, is in really sharp focus. I'd be willing to bet that if we go into your settings, we're going to see all the right things here. Whoa, 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 whoa. So much for that. So you've got an f-stop of 20 here, which isn't necessarily the number that I'd like to see here. For a small depth of field, we'd like to see that it be a smaller number, like an f-stop of 4.5 or an f-stop of 3.5. Of course, you're probably wondering, okay, Tom, I used the wrong aperture setting or wrong f-stop setting, but the technique still worked. I mean, clearly our background's out of focus. What gives here? Well, what I suspect has happened here is you are really close to this leaf right here. And if you remember from the reading in the module, there's 3 factors that are going to affect your depth of field. The f-stop number, the lens you have, and then how close you are in relation to the subject. So in this instance, you're really close to the subject, and by being really close to the subject, you've pulled off that small depth of field effect here. I suspect that if you had gone to an aperture value that is really, really slow or really, really small, this whole background here would have been really out of focus. And just to give you an idea of what I'm thinking about, you know, you probably would have been something like this in the background, probably would have been almost unrecognizable, you know, maybe something like that with that larger or smaller depth, smaller aperture value or smaller f-stop value. So again, you got there a little different way than I probably would have imagined or would have ideally liked you to get there, but nonetheless, you have the effect. So hopefully you understand that the reason this happened was because you were really, really close to your subject, or you zoomed in on your lens, which, to be honest with you, I was looking at your lens and it's a 55mm lens. So you probably couldn't have been zoomed in super far on the telephoto focal length. So I suspect you were just really close to this, which is the thing that made it work. And then we come back to your second image here, large depth of field. And let's look at your settings here. And you're at an aperture value of 25 for sure. That is going to give us a large depth of field. Now, the one thing is here, we look at the wood here in the foreground and we see that it's out of focus. And again, this just goes back to the problem, or not the problem, or the issue that we had with the previous image, is simply that things that are really close to the camera, especially as you physically get close to them, it's going to exaggerate that effect of things being out of focus. So in this instance, that's really why this thing's out of focus. It's just that it's so close to the camera. And it may even be so close to a camera, it might have gone right out of the focal range of a lens. Because if you guys notice, your lens will only focus so close to an object. So if you get down to like 3 or 4 inches of an object, you're going to find that you're not going to be able to focus your lens. It just won't focus that close. So that's why these are out of focus. But large depth of field, I think you really masterfully pulled it off here. Again, if I was just to, go in and just do a crop on this, I probably would give you this photograph because that out of focus stuff in the foreground, I think, really takes away from the beautiful greens here and the nice reflections that are in the lake in the foreground. So good job with it. You took a little bit different approach here, but as long as you got the job done, I am going to be happy with it, and always open to very creative approaches to troubleshooting and technical issues here. So good job with this. Okay, next up we have Allison's images. So first shot, your small depth of field. By the way, Allison, before we get too far here, I want to remind you again to get rid of this. We don't want this. I think I demonstrated for you last week that there are some easy ways to get rid of this, but I'd be willing to bet that you're going to find yourself one day in a situation where you have the date and time on something that you really can't Photoshop out. Again, in this situation, we can get rid of it fairly easily, and especially because this area is kind of busy in a random sort of way. It's pretty easy to get rid of, but you got to get rid of that date on the screen because there's really no reason to have it. I mean, if you need to know what date you took it, it is embedded in the metadata in your camera. It's right there. We know when you took the picture. We know when you modified it. So please, 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 please turn the date off for me. So here, small depth of field, you are in sharp focus on these little droplets of dew and out of focus in the background. And I think you, again, pretty much nailed it. Our background's out of focus, foreground's in focus. I don't know in this situation how close you could have gotten to this, but I'm almost feeling like the closer you get in this image, the more interesting it becomes. And I even kind of like these little pieces of moss or vegetation that are on there. So I'm almost of the mindset that in this image, maybe you want to get even a little bit closer. And quite honestly, the closer you get, the more it's going to exaggerate that depth of field effect on there. So just a little bit of a tip on your composition. But small depth of field, yes, you definitely got that there, and everything looks good on that. So your large depth of field one, this is kind of an interesting shot. So yeah, you've definitely got a large depth of field going on here. It's kind of funny, this person in the background there, it almost looks like, there's some sort of Bigfoot kind of creature walking through the back of the forest there. Kind of funny when I started looking at it real closely. But anyhow, let's look at your settings here. You've got an f-stop of 8, your exposure 1/25th, and your ISO is 12,800. Now in your reflection, and again, everybody, this is really why I want people to write these reflections out. It helps me understand your thought process. And in this instance, Allison, you mentioned that, well, the image is really grainy or noisy, and it's not the quality you want, but you had to compromise. And to me, that tells me a lot. It tells me that you knew that this ISO setting was going to be really bad, But to get these other numbers, you really had to do this. You had to make that compromise. And that tells me you're understanding these functions on these technical functions on your camera, and you understand how there's going to be limitations and how, excuse me, how they're related to each other. So it's really important. And to answer your question and to talk about this a little bit, yeah, that this is the problem why this image is so noisy. It's ISO 12,800. That's super, super high. Even with, some of our really, really high-end cameras, an ISO setting of 12,800 is really going to be pretty noisy. So that's what's going on here with the noise in the image. What's the solution to this? Well, the solution is you got to pack a tripod out into the woods there, and once you have a tripod, you can put the camera on a tripod. You can lower that shutter setting so it's much slower, and as you lower the shutter setting, you're going to have to stabilize the camera, so you can do that with the tripod. And once you've lowered the shutter setting, then you can correspondingly lower the aperture setting, and then you'll be able to get rid of some of that noise in there. I'm sorry, not lower the aperture setting, lower the ISO setting. So, once you get that ISO setting down around 1600, you're going to notice that that noisiness is going to begin to disappear on there. So, you guys probably hear me a lot talking about using a tripod. We have tripods available to you up in the media center, so you certainly are welcome to go up and sign those out. And I know they are like a major hassle to carry around, but when you're first starting in photography, it's a good tool to have, especially for these exercises where you may find yourself having to compromise because you can't use a slower shutter setting. So anyhow, good job here, Allison. Again, I think you've captured the spirit of the assignment. Just want to again restate and hammer home the point that I really want you to turn this date off on your camera. You should be able to turn that off. And again, if you can't figure out where the controls are, refer to that manual that I sent you a PDF of early on in the semester. So look forward to seeing what you got for us in the next assignment. Okay, next up we have Sarah's images. And I really like the approach you took with the series of images. You essentially took a picture of the same thing, maybe change your perspective a little bit, but essentially is the same subject in here. But by changing your shutter, aperture, ISO combinations, you've really taken almost like a completely different looking image in each of these two shots. So your small depth of field image, yeah, right on the money. You've got the coin slot and these two square areas with all the screws and the coin returns and so forth are in focus, and the background is really going out of focus. It's almost kind of like just a blending or a morphing of all these colors in the background, which makes for a palette that really helps this coin slot device really stand out from the background. So I love that a lot. Really nice job. I might consider maybe cropping this a little bit. Something like that. Maybe, maybe not. Always thinking about different ways to present things. So that is definitely what I'm looking for there. Again, we've got an f-stop of 4.5, an exposure of 1/60th of a second, which is perfect, and an ISO of 800. I'm just looking, looks like when you resize this, you resized it pretty small because we're starting to get pixelated in there. Let me just take a look at your image size here. Yeah, so you resized it a little bit small. I think I asked everybody in the assignment to give me images that are 7 inches in the longest direction. So you just resize that a little bit small. One of the ways you can um, go in and resize images is just go into your crop tool, which is this square device, and go, 5 IN for 5 inches in this window, 7 IN for 7 inches, and then for your pixels per inch, I believe I asked you for 72 pixels per inch. So we put that in there, and then that's going to give us a crop exactly to the right size. And if you need to flip it, here we've got a vertical crop, here's the horizontal, and all you do is just click on this check mark, and then that crops it to what we want it to crop. I'm just going to undo that a second. I'm sorry, I did 2 pixels per inch. We want 72 pixels per inch, so that's what the crop. So good job on this. Really liked what you did, and really interesting choice of subject matter. Something different, something very creative here. And then the next shot, again, really love it. And I think this is a really good example of not only doing a proficient job with the technical part of it, I think the image is just really unique and aesthetically pleasing from the perspective of, we've got this really neat juxtaposition of the painting that's super colorful and has sort of all these very random shapes that, laundry typically would have. And then it's juxtaposed against this washing machine or dryer that is full of a lot of squares and a lot of very rigid, hard shapes. And, it's either beige or light white there. So it's monochromatic and doesn't have a lot of color to it. So great job with this assignment. I'm sure if we go in and look at your settings, yep, we've got a high f-stop value on that. It looks like you pushed your ISO up a little bit higher to get that higher f-stop value. So great job with this. Total home run on this one. So good job with that, and hopefully you'll keep up the good work on the remaining assignments. So next up we have Casimir's images, and we've got our small depth of field shot and our large depth of field shot. On the surface here, everything looks like it's right. I bet if we go in and look at your numbers, yes, of course, f-stop of 5, right on the money. And we can see how that translates into this photograph, this Chinese pottery or ceramic is in sharp focus, and the background of the bushes is out of focus. And then the second image here definitely looks like a large depth of field, so I'd be willing to bet if we go in, we look at your numbers, absolutely, f-stop of 22. The one thing here, image looks a teeny bit dark. Let me just show you what this image might look like when I go in and do an adjustment layer. And by the way, so if you look at this thing is called a histogram, and the histogram is kind of a visual map of where the tones are in a photograph, and the dark tones in an image are mapped out on the left side of this, and the bright tones are mapped out on the right side of it. So you can see all of our tones are mostly in the dark area of this image. Excuse me. So we can just, simply take this middle slider and shift those tones over, and now we've got an image that looks like it's exposed a teeny bit better there. So just a quick little fix on that, but other than that, I think the image is really strong, and totally got the technical execution of the large and small depth of field. So good job with this one. And next up we have Christina's images, and Christina's got some photos of her puppy dog here. And our small depth of field image looks pretty good on the surface here. Dog's eyes are in focus and everything else is out of focus. We've got an f-stop of 5, which is perfect for what I'm looking for. The one thing we got going on here is we've got an ISO of 100 and an exposure of 1/6 of a second, which is, again, a very slow shutter setting, and you're going to be susceptible to a little bit of camera shake. So, in this instance, I would normally put this ISO up to maybe 400. That's going to allow us to put this shutter setting at 1/30th or 1/60th. You know, you can play with this as you move this number higher up. So as the ISO value increases, the faster the shutter setting is that you're going to be able to use. And that way you're not going to risk having motion blur in your photograph. Luckily, it looks like either you're balanced on a table or a desk or the floor here, and doesn't look like the dog is moving at all. So everything worked out to your benefit here, and I think it looks good. Then we have image 2, which, if we go in, we look at your file info. Yeah, absolutely, f-stop 29, that's perfect, that's what I'm looking for. But whoa, 1 or 50, not even 1/15th, that's 15 seconds. Gosh, timeout 15 seconds. Can you imagine any living creature actually being able to stay perfectly steady for 15 seconds? And by the way, I'm talking here, I still haven't talked for 15 seconds. So that's a lot of time to remain still. So while you have really good depth of field here, you know, we can see the stuff on the dog that's not moving is definitely in sharp focus. But if you look at his eyes and his head and sort of his chest area, his or her, I'm sorry, this, not sure whether we've got a boy girl or a boy dog or a girl dog. Sorry about that. In either case, you know, if you think about the dog breathing, these are the areas that are probably going to move, and because the shutter's open for 15 seconds, these things are being captured as a slight blur due to their movement. And you know, the other part, his paw here, her paw, that isn't moving, it's probably steady for 15 seconds. You know, I can keep my hand pretty steady on a table for 15 seconds. That turns out to be in sharp focus. So your depth of field area of this assignment, absolutely, you nailed that. But the shutter setting here, it's just way, way, way too long for what we're doing here. So solution is increase the ISO, which is going to allow you to have a faster shutter setting in the image. So keep that in mind as you are working through your next assignment, and hopefully you've got it all worked out when we see your next one. And next up we have Shira's images, and we've got her small depth of field shot here. Looks perfect. I bet if we go in here, we're going to see f-stop of 4, ideal. Shutter setting, again, 1/3 of a second. I'm seeing this a lot. I probably would take this ISO up to 400, and this is going to let me use a little bit larger shutter setting, unless that is if you had your camera on a tripod, then perhaps this is, again, is not going to be an issue. So other than that, really good job with the the small depth of field here. So then we click over to your large depth of field image and go to your file info, and your f-stop is 11 there. And I do see you increased your ISO of 400, which is really good. I appreciate the fact that you recognize that you needed to increase that ISO, and correspondingly you were able to use a higher f-stop number, and you know, still a little bit slow on the shutter settings there. So I'm going to beat you guys up a little bit here this week about these shutter settings, unless that is if you're using a tripod. Again, you didn't mention it in your reflection. So if you did use a tripod, you get a big pat on the back from me. So anyhow, one of the things you mentioned that you thought the image was maybe a little overexposed. And if we look at this histogram again, which is kind of like a map of the exposure of a photograph, which I haven't really talked about a lot yet in our tutorials, but certainly you'll hear about this a little bit as we move forward in the class. But histograms, we generally want them to look like this, kind of like a big mountain range with a big peak in the center of it. That kind of tells us that the tonal range in the photograph is evenly distributed with a lot more information kind of in the middle tones, which would sort of be like this stuff right here. That being said, we don't always have to expose things perfectly, and sometimes when an image is exposed darker, it can be more interesting. And in this case, I kind of like it exposed darker because now it becomes almost to me a little bit more introspective. We've got like this little Buddha thing here, and the candle or the little light here becomes much more emphasized. And there's sort of like an environmental mood here that to me is really appealing. Whereas if we just go back to the way it originally was, it's kind of just like a nice recording of this spot and this object. But I think it lacks a little bit of something that makes me connect to it in a deeper way. Whereas we look at this image, and I really think this image is super moody and super interesting. And I mean, we can go darker and darker on this to really emphasize the light and some of the other stuff here. So just a thought on creativity here. Certainly not something that we're going to hold against you for this assignment, and in fact, your exposure is really ideal here in this assignment. But moving forward, just always try to push yourself and try new and different things. So good job with this, and we will look forward to the rest of your work this semester. Okay, and last but not least, we have Sullivan's images. So I'm assuming that this is a small depth of field shot. Just one quick little note here. Make sure you label these in a manner that helps identify for me what kind of image it is. So in this case, we want to label this with SDOF. So small depth of field in the label here. That's going to help me understand that you are submitting this image as your small depth of field example. So here's the issue with this. There's not a lot of space or depth to this scene. So the subject you chose is relatively flat, the iPhone, and then the carpet behind it is relatively flat. So the scene itself that you selected here doesn't have a lot of depth to it. So for this assignment or for this example, you're probably not going to really notice that much depth of field because there's just naturally not that much visual depth in the scene to begin with. So to do this, what I would have done is maybe put your phone, like stand it up, use something to prop it up, and then put something in the background so there was some space or a gap between the two things that you could demonstrate then this technique by having the foreground in focus and the background out of focus. So these settings would be ideal for a small depth of field image, an f-stop of 5.6. All of these settings are really good. I like this. So that works. And, quite honestly, I really like the aesthetics of this image. It's kind of interesting. The patterns of the weave of the carpet are really contrasted interestingly with the metallic monochromatic color of the iPhone case. So it's a pretty neat juxtaposition and you know, pretty neat photo. But again, you know, I'm not really seeing any example of depth of field here other than the fact that your settings are definitely what they should be. Now, for large depth of field, I see you've moved away from the subject, which certainly is one of the ways we're going to establish large depth of field. But we look at your file info, you know, your f-stop is still pretty low. So in this instance, what you would want to do is lower that exposure number. That's going to allow you to raise that f-stop number and then give you a large depth of field. So again, I don't think you quite pulled it off here in this shot. And of course, we've got to watch out for our fingers in the image here too, or whatever that is in the foreground there. So, you know, again, you kind of started out with a tough subject to demonstrate large and small depth of field with. So, you know, it would be my recommendation to just, you know, as you're playing around some more with your camera and getting to know it a little bit more, try an example where you have two things lined up where one is sort of behind the other so that it gives you a little bit of space to then work with and play around with that large and small depth of field. So practice that a little bit and let me know how that works for you. So for everybody, that is going to wrap up our feedback for assignment 4.1. One thing I do want to make note to everybody as we go along here